Welcome to Coffee with Kupke, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. Here on Coffee with Kupke, we grab a cup of coffee, at least we're claiming this is coffee. We sit with Monsignor Raymond Kupke, the pastor of St. Anthony's in Hawthorne, professor at Immaculate Conception Seminary, diocesan archivist. We sit with Monsignor Kupke to delve into the history of Catholicism in the Diocese of Paterson. My name is Father Paul Manning. I am the vicar for Evangelization for the Diocese of Paterson. And here I am with Monsignor Kupke. So grab your cup of coffee and let's jump right in. I'm going to take a sip. Welcome.
Thank you.
We just had a moment of levity when we started our podcast. We used to have one of those, what do they call those things?
Clapboard.
A clapboard to start. And I don't know, now the technology has changed in the amount of time we've been doing this, we don't use it anymore. We kind of miss it. It made us feel like stars. Anyway.
We're ritualistic.
Yeah, we don't like to change things. We left in our last episode Bishop Casey innovating cautiously, and we talked a little bit about him running into conflict. This era would have been a time that was ripe for conflict.
60s.
Yeah, because of the 60s and all that was going on culturally and ecclesiastically.
Yeah.
So we mentioned last time the New Jersey Committee for Sensitivity and the run-in that they had over St. Thomas More. But there was another little controversy with St. Mary's and Pompton Lakes.
Yes, and I forget what exactly started that.
I think they decided they were going to close the school and give the money, put the money into religious education or something.
Yeah. St. Mary's and Pompton Lakes has always been a large parish by attraction, pulling in from
all
a
over
wider area. So it had a different feel to it, a different vibe to it, and very avant-garde Franciscans were often assigned there.
Yeah. And so somehow in the turmoil post-Vatican II, I think people are thinking that maybe the time for Catholic school is waning, or in any case, the controversy results in Casey getting involved.
Yes, and I think there actually was a formal hearing. It was complicated because I don't think the Franciscan provincial was on board with what Casey wanted to do. I think Casey wanted the pastor to be removed.
Yes.
And the provincial did not want to do that. And so there was a butting of heads. And
the provincial ultimately refused.
Yes.
And the guy stayed.
Right.
So I think this is an interesting moment where the authority of the bishop is
questioned. Yeah.
But you have a great moment. The protesters, I guess, appear. Oh, this is
at Casey's residence.
Yeah. Was this a separate event? This is Joseph Malloy I have.
No, that's St. Jude's in Opatcong.
Okay, so tell us that story.
Casey wanted to remove the pastor.
I think the connection is he didn't succeed with the Franciscan.
But he did succeed in Opatcong.
This is one of his.
This was diocesan clergy.
Right.
And also the reasons were more clear cut.
Okay.
But again, there was a group of people that were very much opposed to this. Malloy had been founding pastor, the first resident pastor of Opatcong.
Okay.
And
he had a loyal following.
Right. And how can I describe this? Malloy was probably the most liberal pastor in the diocese in terms of implementing the farthest limit of where people thought Vatican II was taking them.
Yes.
And Casey, at some point, he crossed the line, and Casey
said enough is enough.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But yes, they came down to Durham Avenue to protest at Casey's house, and he came outside, blessed them all, and walked back inside.
I thought that was a great story. He disarmed them.
He disarmed them. They didn't know what to do.
Yeah,
Right.
that's
Right.
great. I think Bishop Sweeney did something similar. I can't remember exactly what the circumstances were, but he went out and prayed with the people, and yeah.
Yeah.
So probably the biggest controversy, conflict that Bishop Casey had to deal with was a national and international case,
yeah.
the Karen and Quinlan
case.
case. So maybe in a couple sentences, just recap that.
This is a case where a young woman in the diocese from Our Lady of the Lake in Mount Arlington was my recollection. So she had been out on a Friday night and had basically lapsed into a coma.
Yeah. Now, she was in high school at Morris Catholic at the time?
She was
a graduate?
Out of high school at that point.
Okay.
She was a graduate. Her parents were very devout, very involved in parish and wider church work.
A detail that I did not know was that she was adopted.
She was adopted, yes. Yeah.
And was she their only child?
That I'm not sure about.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it must have been heartbreaking. Gosh.
Yeah. And, today there would be different medical approaches, but at this point she was comatose, but not dying.
Yeah, kind of in a vegetative state.
Vegetative state, right. Yeah. And we just happened by the grace of God, to have as their pastor in Mount Arlington, Monsignor Tom Trapasso.
Yes.
Who had a decent education at Catholic U. He was one of the more advanced in theological background in the diocese.
And in particular, moral theology?
Yes.
Yes.
So basically, he guided them through this, and Casey, as the bishop, backed him up to take her off life support, and so it was very controversial because the hospital, St. Clara's Hospital in Denville, which was then a Catholic hospital, did not necessarily agree with their approach. So It went back and forth. But it achieved international fame because this is an era when there were not clear even medical ethics about this era, much less Catholic ethics.
Yes. And so as a result of this, is it too much to say that the church clarifies her position
based on this case? Yeah.
Extraordinary means or
yes.
Disproportionate means of preserving life.
Right.
Respecting the dignity of life and natural death, but also not prolonging life with extraordinary means.
Right. I think we all realized that this was a big deal when, Tom Trapasso got quoted in the Vatican newspaper.
Yes.
A local parish priest. It was a tremendous moment for the diocese, never mind the pathos of the case itself.
Yes.
But, that just a regular parish priest in our diocese would come up with the correct answer and push this envelope, this area of moral theology a little bit, but basically he was quoted in Observatory Romano, and we just all looked back and said, "Wow."
Yeah, and what a great man Tom Trapasso was. Yeah, such a good pastor.
Behind the scenes person in this, though, that often does not get credit is the chancellor at the time, Monsignor Herbie Tillier.
Okay.
Who was advising Casey and Trapasso and did have some background in moral theology. So the three of them together were, coming up with, all right, this is what the church teaches. This is
how it
the
gets
correct
applied.
application of it, and we go with it.
Yeah.
and they
It's amazing how the church was clarifying this idea of life and end of life issues. The pendulum has swung the other way now, where
yes,
people want to
the right to die, the right to kill. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the church walks that via media.
Yeah. We can almost see the import of it, in the photograph in my book, because Casey is sealing the document in which he set this out. We never seal anything, That's a rare occasion. And he's wearing his choir robes.
Wow.
He never wore those, but,
Yeah.
they even realized that, this is going to be a big deal. We better look like we know what we're doing.
Wow. So Karen Ann Quinlan is removed from life support.
And lives like another decade.
9 years. Yeah, another 9 years.
Yeah.
And I think in your book you mentioned that her parents visited every day.
Every day. Yeah.
And I can remember when she died. It was here they thought it was going to probably happen somewhat quickly, and
the rumor at the time was that Casey had the funeral homily written like
ready to go.
Right.
And it happened after he died.
Yeah.
So,
just a little aside from that, when someone that we both know, Steve Seraphin, started working for me in the archives. The first
Dr. Steve Seraphin.
Dr. Steve Seraphin now, who was at St. Vincent's in Madison.
Yes.
He became an archival assistant in college. So the first file I had him organize were the Karen Quinlan papers.
Wow.
And I explained to him, I said, I think this is what we're going to be asked for, because people are going to start to do research in this case. And he had no idea what I was talking about. He had never heard of this, even though he went to the same high school that she did.
Yes.
But a couple of months later, when he was at a family party, and some of his relatives were asking him what he was doing in this strange job in the archives, and he told them about the Karen. He says he was shocked that all of the adults in his family knew about the case and were familiar with it, and that was the first time he realized that this really was a bigger deal than he had suspected.
Yeah. And I wanted to mention, you mentioned Monsignor Tillier's role. So Monsignor Tillier's in retirement now.
Right, at Mary Hart in Succothon.
Yeah. But, I'm glad we gave him a shout out about that. So in 1975, Casey is diagnosed with a tumor. Do you remember what kind of?
Stomach, I think it was.
Okay.
No.
And I guess it moves pretty rapidly.
Yeah, I think the first indication that the broader diocese had, and oddly enough, it's coming up shortly. We're celebrating, among many things that we're celebrating this year religiously. One of them is the 50th anniversary of the canonization of Elizabeth Seton.
Okay.
And Casey was supposed to be one of the 6 bishops celebrating that canonization with Paul VI in St. Peter's Square.
And that would have been
because
of her...
the bishops of the diocese in which the 6 daughter
communities. Yeah.
And Casey was already listed on the program and had to back out at the last moment because, the cancer had become so difficult he could not travel.
And what was this, 76, 75, you said?
75, yeah.
75. And so I guess he carries on until 1977. You say on June 14th.
76, I believe.
Okay. But he resigns.
He resigns, yes. And he has a little, thing in Episcopal American trivia. He has the shortest retirement of any bishop in the history of the country.
Because he resigns?
Not even 24 hours.
Wow.
And on the local level, nobody was kind of surprised in a sense, because that would have been him. All right, I'm done.
Yeah, let me
Let
get
me
off
move
the
on.
stage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. Do you remember, was it particularly difficult at the end for him?
Yes, he was in the house
At
at
Durham
Durham
Avenue.
Avenue, but still taking care of business. You can see in the archives the signatures on some of his last documents is very, very difficult. Tom Reck was bringing him communion every day.
Wow. We had extraordinary ministers
Yeah,
then. Yeah.
all right. And true to form, he wrote his last column for the Beacon,
Wow.
a beautiful column. It's entitled "A Columnist Signs Out,"
Mm.
and he talked about his time in Paterson, and it was just a very poignant time. I think some of us were surprised that he actually was buried here and not in Rochester, and it said something about, he says in his final column, he quotes the book of Psalms. He says, for me, the measuring lines have fallen on pleasant sites. Dear to me is my inheritance.
Mm.
And, we kind of read that, and it kind of indicated that he had come to love Paterson.
Yeah.
And didn't feel a need to be shipped back up to Rochester for burial.
Wow. I think of the affection that our older priests had for him.
Yeah.
Monsignor Flanagan was,
Yes.
I don't
A
know,
young priest, yeah.
but good friends. And just, they all felt like he was,
The real deal.
yeah,
Yeah.
real,
Yeah.
one of them.
Yes.
They could,
Yeah.
say what they felt, and yeah.
The younger crowd, which are now the older crowd, people like Joe Ciampaglio and Kenny Lash and Dick Rento, who were young men that Casey brought into the chancery to help organize and head up these different,
Commissions.
expansions that
Yeah.
he was, they refer to him as Zeus.
Meaning what?
He was almighty. He was.
Oh,
he
yeah.
was it.
And he could throw thunderbolts, I guess, huh?
He could throw. Yes, he could throw thunderbolts. He had a very. He would have meetings, interviews on 10-minute intervals.
Wow.
In a way that nobody else would ever do. You might have a 10:10 appointment in the morning.
Oh.
Of course, somebody else was coming in at 10:20.
Wow.
He would be done with you that quickly because he had to be home for lunch so he could do his writing
Yeah.
in the afternoon.
You at some point you say he liked to stir the pot.
Yes, he would. If he, it's not that he needed projects, but he needed activity. And if things were too quiet, he would call up a few people and say, "What's going on with this?" And then to kind of stir the pot and see what might emerge, what aromas might come out of this.
Wow. Is he? I had a question here.
Monsignor Joe Good has a funny anecdote about him, because at one point, he was living with Casey at Durham Avenue. Most of the time, Casey didn't have one, but in the very beginning, he did. And so he was driving Casey to the Chancery office from Durham Avenue. And
What was Joe Ciampaglio's job at then?
that's Joe Good.
Oh, Joe Good. Sorry, Joe Good.
And he said it was the most harrowing experience of his life, because Casey did not want to be stopped by traffic lights.
Oh,
And so he would be pushing Joe to go faster and faster
to get through.
down
Yeah.
the street, so that Joe's rendition of it, Casey would be sitting there next to him saying, if you move quickly, we can make that next light there, and we'll.
Is that the Holy Spirit calling?
That's Bishop Casey.
Bishop Casey.
So that was Casey. He was impatient.
This is an aside, but Monsignor Flanagan tells the story of a young priest who was a driver for his bishop, and just did not like the job at all and wanted out of it. And so he finally went careening down a one-way road the wrong way.
Convincing the bishop that maybe.
Yeah. So I don't know if I raised this question as a result of something you said, or if you said this in the book, but we talked about the uniqueness of McLaughlin. Like, he was a unique character. All of them were unique in many ways, but was Casey, I say, was he the most unique character since McLaughlin?
Yes. Since McLaughlin, yes. Nava probably would have been if we had had him longer.
Yeah.
You know, we would have a much different diocese. We would be selling a lot more buildings if Nava had
his way,
a longer run of things. But
and maybe still in debt.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. But Casey, you know, he hit the diocese at a time when there was a lot of change going on, and so, you know, to be a bishop of a diocese right after the council during the 60s, you know, all that was going on. It's hard not to make an impression with those circumstances. And Casey,
and in some ways, it seems like he negotiated it well.
He did.
Yeah.
He did. He was able to keep things going and maintain the past while at the same time being very open to different possibilities in the future.
Well,
you know, there's a lot of this building, a lot of Paul Inside the Walls that you can trace back to the initiatives of Casey. Yeah.
Well, eternal rest grant unto him, Bishop Casey. And believe it or not, we have finished chapter 9, and the next time we get together, we're going to begin the last chapter in this volume about the Diocese of Paterson, the last chapter of Living Stones. So we look forward to that.
Good.